In the autumn of 1949, a German builder stood in front of an audience at the Frankfurt Trade Fair, presenting what he believed would revolutionize construction. The machine behind him could be assembled in 2 to 3 hours instead of 2 to 3 days. It could be transported by truck instead of requiring weeks of on-site fabrication. It weighed a fraction of what traditional cranes weighed. He expected orders. He expected interest. He expected recognition. He received none of it. Not one order came in. Not one. The construction industry looked at the TK-10 mobile tower crane and dismissed it. Too light, too simple, too different from what they knew. What happened next would determine whether this was the end of a failed idea or the beginning of an industry transformation. Hans Liebherr returned home after World War II in his early 30s. Germany lay in ruins. The country desperately needed to rebuild, but there was a severe shortage of construction equipment. He lived with his family in a small wooden house he'd built himself, half home, half workshop, a sign of how personal this risk would become. During these years, Hans took over his parents' construction business once again. But as he observed construction sites across Germany, he noticed a critical problem. The cranes available at the time were massive, heavy structures made of iron and cast steel. They took days to assemble and were only practical for major construction projects. Smaller building sites had no mechanical assistance. Workers manually carried stones, mortar, cement, and bricks from trucks to construction areas. This wasn't just inefficient, it was a bottleneck that limited how quickly Germany could rebuild. Hans began sketching ideas for a mobile tower crane that could be easily transported and quickly assembled. But this created a problem no one noticed at the time. Traditional cranes were heavy because engineers assumed weight was necessary for stability. Hans approached the problem differently. Working in a small wooden shed with local blacksmiths and a few skilled workers, he developed his vision into reality. The key innovation wasn't just making things smaller, it was rethinking the entire geometry of the crane. Hans designed the tower crane with a carefully calculated counterweight system. The tower itself was modular, made from sections that could be bolted together. Every component was designed for quick assembly and disassembly. On August 19, 1949, Hans Liebherr received a patent from the German Patent Office for his mobile tower crane, designated the TK-10. Unlike existing cranes that took days to erect, the TK-10 could be assembled in just 2 to 3 hours. It could extend from 4.5 to 16 meters in height and lift between 650 and 2,000 kilograms. The entire crane could be transported on a single truck. For small to medium-sized construction projects, this was exactly what was needed. But Hans still had to convince the industry of that, and this is where most innovations die. That autumn, Hans exhibited his invention at the Frankfurt Trade Fair. The Frankfurt Trade Fair was one of the most important industrial exhibitions in post-war Germany. Builders, contractors, and equipment buyers from across Europe attended to see the latest machinery and technology. Hans arrived with a TK-10 confident that once people saw it in operation, orders would follow. He demonstrated the crane. He explained the assembly process. He showed how quickly it could be moved from site to site. The response was crushing disappointment. Not a single order came in. If this crane failed, Hans wouldn't just lose a product, he would lose everything he had left after the war. Years later, Hans would recall that moment, saying he could have ended his crane production right then. The construction industry's rejection wasn't based on performance. The TK-10 worked exactly as Hans claimed. The problem was that it didn't fit what builders expected. Traditional cranes were massive, permanent installations. They signaled serious construction. The TK-10 looked too simple, too light, too much like something that couldn't possibly handle real construction work. Builders looked at it and thought, if this were a good idea, someone would have done it already. This is the pattern that kills most innovations. Not technical failure, but psychological resistance. Most entrepreneurs would have reconsidered. Hans Liebherr did not. At this point, Liebherr had no market, only conviction. He believed the problem wasn't the crane, the problem was that builders hadn't yet experienced the alternative. So he made a decision that would define not just this product, but his entire career. He began building cranes anyway, confident that customers would come. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't seek additional validation. He committed his own capital to manufacturing a product that had no confirmed market. This decision nearly bankrupted him. Hans understood something fundamental about innovation adoption. People don't buy what they don't understand. But once they see it working on an actual job site, once they see a competitor using it successfully, once they realize they're at a disadvantage without it, adoption becomes inevitable. He just had to survive long enough for that realization to occur. Weeks later, an order arrived for a crane to help rebuild the town hall in Württemberg. The construction team had heard about the demonstration at Frankfurt. They were willing to try it because they had a specific problem: a building site with limited space and limited time. The TK-10 solved both problems. It arrived on a truck, it was assembled in the morning. By afternoon, it was listing materials that would have required days of manual labor to position. The construction industry took notice. Word spread through professional networks the way it always does in specialized industries. When someone sees a competitor finishing a job faster with less labor cost, they pay attention. The TK-10 was called a new magic machine. Orders began flowing in. That same year, 1949, Hans founded Hans Liebherr Maschinenfabrik in Kirchdorf. Business expanded rapidly. Hans modified the TK-10 and developed multiple crane models with varying performance specifications. Because the cranes were built in series production, he could offer them at competitive prices. Within weeks, the small workshop transformed into a factory. By 1950, Liebherr was producing dozens of mobile tower cranes. By 1951, hundreds. Other manufacturers watched this with growing concern, but that assumption would quietly destroy every incumbent. Within 5 years, every major European crane manufacturer would either license the design or develop their own inferior versions. The construction equipment industry had ignored the TK-10 at Frankfurt because they believed their existing products were adequate. They were wrong, but not because their cranes didn't work. Their cranes worked fine for the projects they were designed for. The mistake was assuming that's all the market needed. Post-war Germany had two construction realities happening simultaneously. First, there were major reconstruction projects in cities. These required the large, heavy cranes that already existed. Second, there were thousands of smaller projects: residential buildings, small commercial structures, infrastructure repairs. The TK-10 didn't compete with large cranes, which meant no existing customer wanted it. It created a new category. It made mechanical lifting economically viable for projects that had never had access to it before. This is why the industry initially missed it. They were looking at their existing customers and seeing no problem. They weren't looking at the customers who couldn't afford to be their customers. By the time they realized what was happening, Liebherr had already established dominance in that category. Traditional crane manufacturers faced a choice. They could continue ignoring the mobile crane market and cede it entirely to Liebherr, or they could develop their own versions. They chose the latter. Within a few years, multiple manufacturers introduced mobile tower cranes, but Liebherr had the advantage of moving first. They had production experience, they had dealer relations, they had customers who could testify to the crane's effectiveness. Throughout the 1950s, Liebherr released updated models with increased capacity, improved stability, and easier assembly. The mobile tower crane became standard equipment on construction sites across Europe. What had been mocked at Frankfurt in 1949 became indispensable by 1955. Builders who had dismissed it as too light, too simple, too unconventional, now found they couldn't compete without it. The TK-10 followed the pattern of disruptive innovation perfectly. It started by serving small construction projects that couldn't afford traditional cranes. Then it improved until medium-sized projects preferred it. Eventually, even large projects began using mobile cranes for specific tasks because they offered flexibility that permanent installations couldn't match. By the 1960s, mobile tower cranes weren't an alternative. They were the default. The success of the TK-10 established a principle that would define Liebherr's approach for decades. Hans didn't just build what the market asked for. He built what he observed the market needed, even when the market didn't yet recognize that need. This required two things most companies don't have: direct observation of actual work and financial independence. Because Hans financed everything from his own capital, he didn't need to justify the TK10 to investors or lenders who would have demanded proof of market acceptance before production. He could build first and let the market catch up. In 1953, Hans rented a cable excavator for a construction project. He was dissatisfied with its poor power-to-weight ratio. Just 8 months later, he presented the L300, the first hydraulic excavator in Europe. Weighing only 7.5 tons with 25 horsepower, it was 4 times lighter than comparable machines. The pattern repeated. Hans identified inefficiency. He built a solution. The industry initially resisted. Then they had no choice but to adopt it. Today, mobile tower cranes are ubiquitous on construction sites worldwide. Every major construction equipment manufacturer produces them. They're so common that most people don't think about them. But in 1949, they didn't exist. The Frankfurt Trade Fair rejection wasn't an anomaly. It was the predictable response when something genuinely new appears. Industries don't reject innovations because they're irrational. They reject them because innovations challenge assumptions that have worked in the past. The lesson isn't that industries are foolish. The lesson is that structural barriers to innovation are real, and overcoming them requires more than a good idea. It requires the ability to act without permission. Hans Liebherr had that ability because he financed his own work. He didn't need the industry's approval. He didn't need investors' consensus. He needed only his own conviction and his own capital. When the Frankfurt Trade Fair produced 0 orders, he could afford to keep building anyway. When the first customer took a risk on the TK10, he could afford to support them fully to ensure success. When competitors eventually copied his design, he could afford to keep improving faster than they could catch up. The real innovation wasn't the crane, it was the ability to survive long enough to be proven right. Most innovations die not because they don't work, but because their inventors can't survive the gap between "this works" and "the market accepts this works." Hans Liebherr survived that gap, and by surviving it, he forced an entire industry to change. Industries don't change when they're convinced, they change when they're cornered.